Okay, let's set up Bitbucket authentication for our Supabase application. So what you're going to do is start by going to bitbucket.org. That'll take you to the home page. Make sure you're logged into Bitbucket. Once you're logged in, you should be at your dashboard page, as you see here. And then down at the lower left corner of this page, you're going to see your profile and settings. This will be an avatar. If you've uploaded an avatar, otherwise it might just have your initials. Go ahead and click on that and click on all workspaces and select your workspace. If you've created one, it might just have your name if you haven't created one like I have here. After you've selected your workspace, click on settings and scroll all the way down and to the left and click on OAuth consumers, and it's under apps and features. Now we're going to add a new OAuth consumer for our application, and you start by putting in an application name. This is required. After your application name, you need to put in the callback URL. Now the callback URL is the same for all of your providers, and here's how you find your callback URL. Go to your Supabase project that you've already created. Create one if you haven't already, but click on the project and then go down to settings for your project and API. And here's your API URL. This part here is the project ID. If you ever need the project ID or if support asks you for that, that's where you'll find this. Go ahead and hit copy on that, and then go back into Bitbucket, and you're going to paste that into the callback URL field, and then you're going to always add this to the end of your callback URL. It's /AUTH/v1/callback, CALLBACK. And this callback URL is the same for all of your providers, Google, Apple, Facebook, doesn't matter. They'll all have the same callback URL. And there's one more thing you're going to need to do is select a permission. The minimum permissions you probably will want is to be able to read the email for the client. That'll populate the email in your application. So go ahead and hit save. And now you have an OAuth consumer. You can click on your OAuth consumer here, and you've created a key and a secret that you can add to your project, your Supabase project. So let's go ahead and copy the client ID. They call it a key here. We're going to copy to the clipboard. We're going to go back to our Supabase project, and we're going to go over to Authentication and Settings. We're going to scroll down and find Bitbucket. There we go. So make sure Bitbucket is enabled if it's not enabled, and once you've enabled it, you can paste the key, the client ID key that we just got from Bitbucket, into this field, and go back to Bitbucket and copy the client secret to the clipboard, and then come back over to your project and paste it in, and then go ahead and save it. So now your keys are set up in your Supabase project. One other important thing to note is that you put the correct site URL. This URL is where your application lives on the web. So if this is a progressive web app, it'll be the actual web location of your application. It defaults to localhost for testing, but it's not going to work in production unless you put the production URL for your app right here. Okay, so we've got everything set up for our application, the OAuth consumer. Now all we need to do is add some code to log into our application. And so this is JavaScript. We're using the Supabase JavaScript library. So we're going to start with importing the create client object from Supabase JavaScript library, and now we're going to add a reference to the Supabase object that we're going to need to use. So to get that, we're going to go back to our project and go down to API. What's nice is you need these keys in order to be able to do that under Authentication, and Supabase conveniently does this for you. They give you the code that you need. So what we're going to do is just copy this client API key to the clipboard, and then we're going to go back to our code. We're going to paste that into our code. So there's a constant setup for Supabase key, and then we're going to copy the Supabase URL and the instantiation code for the Supabase object. So there's just two pieces of code here. We're going to copy and paste this back in here. And here's your Supabase URL. Again, here is your project ID. And here's the instantiation. It creates a constant for Supabase, so you're ready to use it. You can get rid of this process. env would only be for a node application, and this is a client application, so we don't need that. Okay, so let's create two functions for logging in and logging out. So my first function is going to be called login Bitbucket. Typically what I'll do here is create a generic function called login provider and then pass it a variable, and that same variable can be used for all the different providers. So you just pass in the provider name. So right now we're only working with Bitbucket, so we're going to just create a login Bitbucket function, and then we're going to create a function for logging out of the application. If you log in, you have to be able to log out. Okay, now these functions will be added to a button that says login with Bitbucket, or some text on the screen, or maybe an icon, a Bitbucket icon. However you want to handle that, it's up to you. Now we need the code to do the actual login. Well, guess what? That's already done for you at the Supabase site. So if you go to the Supabase documentation, you look up the under reference, under auth, and you go to sign in. Once you find the sign-in page, go down to sign in with third-party providers, and here's the code that we need. So we're just going to hit copy, go back to our code, and paste that into our function. And then change this from GitHub, which is the default, to Bitbucket. But like we said before, you can create a generic function and then pass it the name of your provider, and one function can log into literally 8 different providers, which is pretty cool. And now we need that function for log out. So let's go back to the documentation and look at auth.signout. And this is literally one line of code, but I don't need to even type one line of code because I can paste it right into my logout function. Okay, there we have it. Our entire application is set up to log into Bitbucket, log out of our application. We're done and ready to go.